Mr. Speaker, for decades now, the international community has sought a two-state solution in a way that's only incentivized Israel to attack the territorial integrity of the Palestinian people militarily, through settlements, and through embargoes that make it impossible for those people to do anything but live in the desperation of poverty. Today is about a choice. We can continue down that long path, but it won't lead to peace. Or we can change tack, and the international community can throw its support behind a solution that is most likely to be accepted and that will lead to better outcomes for both the Israeli and Palestinian people. That's what we propose to do on this side of the House. What are we going to do? We want to see a federal system with a national government that allows for regional representation. So we'll allow Palestinian voting areas where Palestinians live and Israeli regions where Israeli lives, and there'll be some mixed areas as well where those populations overlap. We predict that those populations will overlap in places like Jerusalem. We're going to allow and include everyone in that franchise that currently lives in those states, Israelis and Palestinians. And the process by which we're going to achieve it is by targeting all future negotiations at that particular solution and not allow the two-state solution to remain a viable option on the table for both of those parties. We believe the United States, in its powerful relationship with Israel, should come out strongly in support of that particular solution and advocate it both behind closed doors and in public to pressure the Israeli people to that particular conclusion. 3 points are substantive for me in this speech. Firstly, why Israel nor Palestine has a right to a unilateral religious state in a way that the international community should respect when it comes at the cost of peace and comes at the cost of internal progress. Secondly, why a two-state solution will always fail to be negotiated, and why the only opportunity for regional success in the negotiations that we see is a one-state solution. And finally, why this best meets the international community's obligations that must exist for the Palestinian people who are currently suffering. Firstly, why did Israel and Palestine have a right to a religious state? We think that Israel was created in 1948 after a legacy of a terrible tragedy that existed in World War II. And it was created to give the Jewish people a homeland, to ensure that that tragedy was never inflicted again upon that people, and ensure that those atrocities were never repeated. There was no need for that state to necessarily be one of religious uniformity. It just needed to be a state that could have arms negotiations with the rest of the world, a state that could pursue economic growth on its own terms and provide a safety net for its own people should they seek to live there. There are 3 things that a religious state comes at the cost of that means that we should never allow it to be weighed out in favour of those things. Firstly, we say that religious states are fundamentally exclusory internally. They limit the democratic mandate of a particular government within unacceptably confined boundaries in a way that is fundamentally illiberal to the minorities that will always exist within that state that don't ascribe to that particular religion. That's particularly true of Israel when it was created on land that already existed and for a people that already lived there. We think that to allow Israel a state that says that this can be a particularly Jewish nation when the Palestinians will never accept that reform is unacceptable and untenable. And that leads to the second point, which is that religious state, that religious demand, comes at the opportunity of peace. Because to the extent that there are 2 negotiating parties at this table, and both of them ascribe to particularly mutually exclusive forms of religions, we don't think that they're ever going to accept a bargain that says that you can have your religious state and we will have ours, and there'll be our mosques collected when the sacred sites of both of those parties exist on one set of territory, and we can't negotiate access in a way that is amenable to both of those parties, or autonomy in a way that is amenable to both of those parties. But finally, we think it's binary in disrespecting the religious and other rights of other people in the international community. We don't think that the international community should respect or elevate one particular religion to the level of having a particular state. The existence of currently religious states doesn't mean that the international community should foster them to exist above and beyond the bigger considerations of peace and security for people worldwide and the human rights of those people. So secondly, this is the biggest question this debate, is why would a two-state solution always fail? And why is a one-state solution the most viable option for an international community to pursue in terms of an agreement? The way in which negotiations have broken down in the past have been for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's because of geographical assets that will never be agreed upon in the way that those 2 parties negotiate. So we're talking about settlements. At Oslo, which is the closest that we've ever come to getting agreement, the initial bargain was that we would allow 20% of Palestinian sovereignty over the West Bank. Over the course of those negotiations, Israel backed that down to 6%. Neither the 20% nor the 6% were amenable to the Palestinian people. We don't think that they want partial control of the West Bank. They want the full thing. And Israel is never going to give it up. So So to that extent, that's a sticking point in terms of those negotiations. The second thing is sacred sites. To the extent that Jerusalem and the Temple on the Mount are both sacred to Palestinian people and Jewish people, the way in which those sites are controlled and access to those sites are regulated has been a sticking point as well. Palestinians haven't been willing to accept Israeli guarantees that those things will be freely accessible to Palestinian people, and those guarantees haven't been forthcoming anyway. But finally, it's about economic assets and the right of return of Palestinian people to work within whatever an Israeli state would be when they live there already. We think that firstly, to the extent that these guys support a two-state solution with right of return, that fundamentally dilutes any claim that those people have to a religious state in the first place at the principal level. But the second thing is that any two-state solution is fundamentally going to disenfranchise the Palestinian people and make them an inferior state to the way that Israel would exist. Why is that? It's the second reason that these two-state solution negotiations have always broken down. It's because they create incentives for Israeli build-up. So it's like Israeli territory on the West Bank isn't just settlements. They've created an artificial buffer between the territory that they hold in former settlements and any Palestinian authority. Firstly, to improve their claims to access to that territory in any future negotiations. But secondly, because they have a rational reason when Hamas are firing Qassam rockets into their cities to ensure that they are as far away as possible. You create and can continue those incentives because the establishment of a border across an arbitrary border in that doesn't stop that animosity across that border. But thirdly, we think that the fear that that border creates when Palestine is now able to enter its own trade negotiations, its own arms agreements in the region, is made much, much worse. So Israel is never going to accept the idea of a Palestinian state on its border whilst Hamas is active and whilst it exists in the way that it does. But finally, we say that there are huge, historical, ethnic problems in the way that those political resolutions come about that have led those people within those countries to move to the extreme and seek things like a blockade, seek to restrict the resources of electricity and water for Palestinian people. The importance of all of this is conflict minimization. The reason that we need a solution is because at the moment Israel is getting more and more egregious in terms of their violations. So like the 6-day war, in response to Qassam rocket attacks, and Mossad agents that are crossing international borders to abduct or assassinate other people. A one-state solution includes both parties in one national franchise. So even though you have political disagreement, that political disagreement doesn't need to manifest itself in the way of violence, in the way of geographical boundary pushing, as it currently does. We think we alleviate those concerns. Finally, why is this best for the Palestinian people? We think that when the Palestinian people currently exist in poverty, when only a small percentage of their population can access electricity and clean water, we need to desperately include them in the franchise. This will give them votes that will put people in the Knesset. This will allow them to push towards enabling Fatah and minimising and changing the way in which Hamas negotiates in those operations. Because no longer will those people need to make the claims that they do about being so disenfranchised. When they have one parliament and representatives that they can vote for themselves, we think that you enfranchise them in a way that's incredibly powerful. Mr. Speaker, the long road to peace needs to change course. We are proud to propose.
Our stance in this debate is clear. We think the Palestinian people deserve and want a state of their own. We think a two-state solution is infinitely more likely to occur than a one-state solution. We in fact think Israel is never going to accept a one-state solution and needed to do a hell of a lot more in this debate to prove they would. We also think, irrespective of the likelihood of either of these options being successful, a one-state solution would be a terrible idea for the Palestinian and the Israeli people. Those are the things I'm going to prove in this speech. Before I get there, I'm going to set out our 6-point model on the -10. First of all, we propose a two-state solution, obviously, whereby the West Bank would become Palestine. We think Gaza would be enveloped into Egypt because a non-contiguous state is entirely dysfunctional, so we're not going to set one up. And we think ethnically and politically they're similar to Egypt, so we think that'll be successful. Thirdly, we think Israel will give up settled land in the West Bank, as they offered to do in Gaza in 2006, and in fact did do in Gaza in 2006. We think they'll do that again. Fourthly, there'll be elections in the West Bank where anyone can run, including Hamas, including Fatah. Fifthly, Jerusalem would be a UN-administered territory in the same way that Kosovo was, which would allow equal access to both Jews and Arabs. We think that would solve a lot of those problems. We think the new capitals would be Tel Aviv and Ramallah. And finally, we think that the new Palestinian state would get significant international aid in the first instance to establish all of those things and deal with all of those problems Ed spoke about, like, for example, a lack of electricity. I'm going to ask one question in rebuttal before I deal with the rest of Ed's case in my substantive. And that question is, does Israel deserve a religious state? Because Ed told us, strangely enough, that Israel was established in order to protect the Jewish population and that threat no longer exists. Just because the focal point of that threat has moved to a different threat does not mean there is not currently an existential threat to the Jewish people. We think that threat might not be Nazi Germany, but it certainly is the Arab world. And it needs to do a hell of a lot more than simply saying we established it for reasons that are outdated. We think there's still a huge amount of fear on behalf of the Jewish population. There's still a huge amount of risk to those people. Secondly, though, he said they do not have a right to a state because the land on which their state is founded was taken from others. A, we point to the founding of every single modern state in the entire history of the world, essentially, and say that's true all of the time. But secondly, we're going to fix that problem by giving Palestinians a state. So we think that wasn't enough in this debate to prove that Israel can't and shouldn't exist. Finally, he told us religious states are anti-democratic. We don't think that was enough, given the state of Israeli politics and the fact that it is a democratic country and in fact votes on things other than just religious lines, and that wasn't sufficient in this debate. The conclusion of all of that is this. We don't think this debate is about the principal right of Israel to maintain its state. We think it's about the effectiveness of creating a one-state solution or the effectiveness of creating a two-state solution. That's what I'm going to get now. I'm going to give you 2 points of substantive in this debate. First, why a one-state solution will fail to ever occur and why a two-state solution is more likely. And secondly, why irrespective of the likelihood, a one-state solution will be a bad outcome. So first, why do we think a one-state solution will fail? I'm going to analyse 3 actors here: Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East in its entirety. So first, with regards to Israel. The biggest stumbling block in all the negotiations Ed wanted to point you to on Israel's side has been the fear of being overrun by an Arab population. So let's deal with the facts of this situation. Demographically, in the state of Greater Israel that included the Palestinian territories, there would be significantly more Arab humans than there would be Jews, thus meaning that Arabs would be a voting majority in that state and a demographic majority in that state. And that's precisely, Mr. Speaker, why Israel will never agree to a one-state solution. It's precisely why the major stumbling block, as they pointed you to, has been a right of return. That evidence is exactly what we're saying in the negative, which is that Israel isn't going to give that kind of power over to Arabs. We think that's true. We think that points to the fact, for example, with regards to Camp David, where Iraq offered 95% of territory to Palestinians, but would not offer a right of return because we think that's a major stumbling block on the part of Israel. We don't think the pressure of the United States is going to be enough to overwhelm the fear that Israel has with regards to letting in huge numbers of Arabs who are now going to take control of their country. We don't think they ever analysed why it would be sufficient in this debate. But secondly, with regards to Palestine, we think for a start, they want a state of their own, so we think it's unlikely they're just going to concede and move into the Israeli state. But secondly, we think they deserve the land that they actually have right now, and we think they will continue to fight for that land. We think the entire political rhetoric of Hamas has been about fighting for that land and has been about establishing a Palestinian state. Thirdly, with regards to the Middle East as a whole, every Middle Eastern proposal, including the most recent Arab peace proposal, has called for a two-state solution. The Middle East doesn't want a one-state solution. It's afraid of the outcomes of a one-state solution, and we think it's very unlikely to support one. For those reasons, we think it's very unlikely that it will occur. But we think secondly, and this is part B of this argument, merely striving for a one-state solution is incredibly harmful because we think it misdirects the focus of negotiations to things that will actually never be solved and are never going to see a political resolution. For example, moving everybody into one big state. We think that two-state solutions and negotiations therein have failed. We think those stumbling blocks are going to be fixed by and large by our model, and we think we're going to move forward on that where we wouldn't be able to with a one-state solution. Secondly though, why do we think a two-state solution is likely? Ed pointed to a whole lot of reasons why Palestinians have wanted and fought for the right of return. We give you 2 parts of this analysis as to why they will accept our model without a right of return. For a start, we think by and large a right of return is indicative of the fear that Palestinians hold that they will not get access to Jerusalem unless they are allowed to enter the Israeli state. We think by guaranteeing them access to Jerusalem in the way we have with the UN Protectorate means they'll be willing to give up the right of return. But secondly, and Ed pointed this out in his speech, they often call for a right of return because of the economic power that Israel has and the economic opportunity that they would get by being able to return to Israel. We think our model of international aid and support for the establishment of an economy in Palestine means they are likely to accept a state even without the right of return. We think that's incredibly likely, and certainly a one-state solution isn't. But irrespective of that, even if we could get a one-state solution, I'm going to tell you why it's a terrible idea. Firstly, with regards to Palestinians, we think, practically speaking, we're going to see bad outcomes for them. We'd point you to the fact that despite the fact that there will be a voting majority, that Israelis will have the money and the political power to potentially dominate them regardless of the voting power of those individuals. And we point you to plenty of examples of where that's true in the Middle East, like Syria and like Iraq. We think that means that that they can be disenfranchised in really meaningful ways. And we point you to ways that happens under the status quo. Like, for example, Palestinians being denied access to trade unions and being denied access to government housing. I think all of those things are potentially going to happen again and even more problematically under their model. Secondly, with regards to build-up, Ed told us that it would be good for Palestinians because there would be no incentive for Israel to keep building up and taking their land. Let's be clear about what a one-state solution in its best form does. It gives all the land that Israel are currently on, it gives all those settlers no reason to move. We don't think that it's ever likely under a one-state solution the Israeli government is going to force those individuals to move because they're now part of one big state. So they don't fix the land problems, we think we're infinitely more likely to fix them on our side. But finally, with regards to identity, we think Palestinians want a state of their own. We think they want a state that reflects their ethnic majority, reflects their views, which they will never get in an Israeli state. Secondly, why do we think this is bad for Israel? We think Israel feels, as Ed considered, like it's constantly under threat. We don't think you change that dynamic by simply moving the threat within their own borders. If anything, we think you increase the likelihood that that threat is manifested in the types of violence that Ed wanted to point you to. Because at no point in Ed's speech did he actually analyse why the Palestinians would be likely to give up on Hamas, why the Israelis would be likely to let go of the military power they have over the Palestinians just because it's an internal state. We think it's even worse and made even more problematic when you have them within one state. Because if their model actually does what they intended to do and create a voting majority, then Israel will be suppressed. So no matter what you do in the system, somebody loses out. We think the two-state solution is the best balancing act. It gives each party what they want, and it's infinitely more likely we're happy to oppose.
We were never willing to just rely on the past and rely on what previous negotiations had tried and failed to achieve. What we wanted to do was change the calculus of Palestinian citizens, of acknowledging that a right of return would be a sticking point. So in return, we would do things to assuage the incentives that operated to make them want a right of return, to have access to Jerusalem, to have access to a state that would allow them to have a job and to work and to live like a productive and happy life. Those were the reasons that we wanted to change the balance, and it wasn't good enough for Nina just to point to the past and lean back on us saying that the right of return is a sticking point. That's why we wanted something different. In substance, I'm going to discuss why Palestinians have the right to a legitimate and self-determining state, and how a one-state solution would inflame the region. But before I do that, two questions in a row. First, will Palestinians or Israelis ever accept the model? Because the first thing we were told was that no one would ever accept a situation in which Jerusalem was a UN-mandated zone, and that Palestinians just wouldn't be game enough to accept that. We thought that was unlikely. We said that sites like Kosovo being administered by the UN had shown you could have massively conflicting ethnic groups who had literally tried to kill each other and exterminate and commit genocide against each other, could have and coexist in a stable society. So that wasn't good enough on their side. But we also said that with a balancing act. Would Israel be happier to give up some degree of autonomy over Jerusalem, knowing that they still had access to the religious and cultural sites within it, contrasted to having a flood of Arabs swishing across their country, massively changing the demographic boundaries in a way that they already fear, and in a way that they already conduct heinous border and oppressive policies to counteract against. And we also showed you why people were worried about the right of return and why they wanted it. We said it was better to have a state in which Palestinians could be happy and a state in which they could access Jerusalem and feel that they could go to the Dome of the Rock and worship like that. And that was why they wanted to be able to get into Israel in the first place. We said that the right of return wasn't just a blanket desire to return to Israel, it was motivated by different things. And that's why Nina's insistence that it was a sticking point just wasn't good enough. But then we were told that, settlements were this complete sticking point, that no one would ever be willing to give them up, and that even if they were, that Gaza is the biggest part of Palestine, and that would be a sticking point for the Palestinians. Nina, Gaza's a city. Gaza is one city. It's a tiny little speck on the map. That's why I call Gaza Strip. It's not the West Bank, which is, as you would expect, the entire bank of a river, and is the large part of Palestine that is not connected to Egypt. But also, Gazans can go and chill with their Muslim brotherhoods. Hamas is literally a more militant offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So to the extent that you are worried about Israel, you are worried about Gazans not being able to have a satisfied political and ethnic life, they are more than willing to integrate with Egypt. To it, they are next to it, they have the same political makeup as it, and they are probably going to get pretty militant by the notion that their country is just being absorbed by Israel. So to the extent they were worried about that, that was problematic. But as to settlements, because we said that there have been Israeli leaders willing to compromise on settlements before. Ehud Barak has been willing to do it. You'll note that Ariel Sharon completely pulled settlements out of Gaza in the past. So just saying that there was no Israeli leader who was ever willing to compromise on settlements wasn't just silly, it was factually inaccurate. So what would this state look like? Because Nina told us that it was contradictory for us to say that Israel was afraid of being overrun, but would then pass oppressive regimes. No. What we said was that Israel fears that, and that even if that fear is irrational, that would be the reason why they would never accept this policy. But then, if they did accept that policy, they would do anything they could to prevent that overrunning from within the state. To prevent that demographic shift that meant that you couldn't have Arab political parties of being more prevalent in the parliament. That was why they would do things like they currently do, like making it so that you had to serve in the military to get access to government housing, which Arabs can't do, meaning that Arabs can't collectivise and be involved in labour unions. They already do these things when Arabs are not in mass numbers coming across from Palestine, coming across from the West Bank. We think that trend is only ever going to get worse. But then what's best for Israel? Because we said that they were told us that Israel was an illegal state, and that it's really bad for moderate Jews that they are forced to go through an increasingly religious state. Firstly, we would suggest that having your country overrun with Muslims is hardly a moderating influence, because you feel that you have to preserve your old ways, you have to preserve religious schooling, you have to preserve public expressions of Judaism in an open space. So to the extent that that is a problem, that is a much bigger problem under your model. But also, how does having a group of new people who aren't really concerned with the moderating process in your state, and aren't really concerned perhaps with the very subtle distinctions between different schools of Judaism and progressive Judaism or Orthodox, I don't really understand why Arabs would have a huge incentive to be like, so we're back in our homeland now, I know what we'll do, we'll start reforming the Israeli school system. Why was that the crucial moderating influence that they wanted? And then they wanted to say that there's huge tensions within the region. Look, that's probably true. That is true under the status quo. Is it more likely that Arab states that believe that they and other Arabs and other Muslims have a legitimate desire for political autonomy and political representation should be subsumed by the Zionist oppressor? Is it more or less likely that Hamas would continue to be a radical group that's one aim is for legitimate Palestinian statehood? So in that context, which is it more likely that Arabic groups would be violent and militant? So, why do Palestinians have a legitimate right to self-determination? First, what are the categories that we generally avoid stating? First is border lines. Can the people secure their borders? Can they protect themselves? We think Palestinians amply satisfy that category. The West Bank is a very clearly defined area. Land swaps can be conducted to make it a contiguous area, to make it such that Ramallah is a functioning capital. Is there a unique culture and heritage that binds these people together such that they cannot be legitimately represented in another context? Absolutely, Madam Speaker. The Palestinian mandate under the British Authority did not give adequate representation to these people who have had a link to holy sites, who have had a link to these communities for a very long time. We think that's adequately satisfied. Finally, do they have the ability to effectively govern their own borders? We think that Fatah has done a pretty good job under Mahmoud Abbas of standing up to the Israeli government and cooperating when it's needed. We think he's shown all the qualities that are needed in an effective leader. So why do we acknowledge that statehood is important? Because where you're born is largely an accident, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker, I'm unsure of who is speaking at this point. Because citizens should have the ability, and all people acknowledge that citizens should have the ability to decide their form of governance. Because those borders, those cultural recognition, all those things are what we say are key to people having a stake in the state of their own society. So firstly, then these people moving to Israel and becoming part of the one-state solution have less ability to govern themselves in that one-state capacity. Firstly, because we said they'd be disempowered politically, because the Israeli majority would never be willing to accept an Arab vocal minority who was willing to press for change. But secondly, and more importantly, because international communities are much less willing to intervene in domestic political matters than in between conflicts between two nation states, than willing to get involved in the preventing of hostilities across borders. So that means that it is much harder for people to have legitimate representation in a state where they are being oppressed by a dominant religious minority. So self-determination in a one-state solution is always going to be much more unlikely, regardless of the kind of federalized Arabic/Israeli regions that they wanted to discuss. That's why a two-state solution provides the best option for people to have a legitimate say in how they conduct affairs. But let's look at how a one-state solution would inflame the region. Because other Arab states see and describe and get a huge deal of rhetorical power from portraying Israel as the Zionist oppressor. Their rhetoric is built around demonizing it. The fact that they fought a holy Muslim war against them in 1967 to try and drive them into the sea. It was a tragedy. They were unsuccessful. Given that there is the new Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, as Nina was quite happy to discuss, we think that those kinds of groups, those post-Arab Spring democracies who are more willing to engage with Israel now, would never be happy in engaging with a state that had literally subsumed an entire race of their Arab brothers, of their Muslim brothers, into a state that would be guaranteed to demonize and politically repress them. We think that means that we should do things like sponsor Hamas in a situation where they don't have the ability to get legitimate political representation. Because this wasn't just about looking at the past and saying that the past has failed, ergo we need to do something change the calculus for both parties to this debate. That's why the motion falls.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you're generously to me. But a couple of things. The first was that if it was true that the Palestinians had such a unique cultural heritage that meant that they met the criteria of the statehood, it seemed unlikely that the people of Gaza would merely accept being subsumed with their other Muslims in Egypt, Mr. Speaker. But if it was true that the affirmative team wanted to hang their hat on the bastard case that is Kosovo in this debate, Mr. Speaker, as an example of a functioning economy and state that had been separated successfully from another state, then that was also deeply problematic for the affirmative team. I'm going to deal with a number of things in this debate, broadly answering two questions. The first being, which solution should we pursue with the greatest likelihood of it being accepted, and which solution is the most legitimate for both parties or all parties involved in this debate. To do that, I'm going to begin by talking about the extent to which these guys have modified this brand new approach to the two-state solution they've invented that hadn't been tried before and hadn't failed many times before. And I'm going to look at the reasons why that will never be accepted by both parties. Then I'm going to look at the reasons why it's more likely that Israel will accept a solution that doesn't require them to give up key resources and key sticking points, if that was their model in this debate. And finally, I'm going to look at which state will operate better in terms of dealing with the tensions where they occurred. So firstly, they told us that, in 2006, Israel offered to give up some territory in the West Bank, and so that was an indication that maybe they'd give up territory in the West Bank under their model. In 2006, as Ed told you, they offered to give up 20% of the West Bank, and as those negotiations continued, they offered to give up 6%. Here's a number of reasons why they're never going to give up that entire solution. The first is that the PLO has never accepted anything except full sovereignty since 1988. They've never voted for it, they've never agreed to it. The second is that there are 141 settlements with 230,000 Israelis living on the West Bank currently. It would cost more than $75 billion to compensate those people to move back into the Israeli state. They weren't going to do it. Even under the current US president, who was willing to pressure the Israeli state to limit those settlements, the Israeli housing department supplies $50 billion in subsidies to continue those developments, to continue to increase their leverage position in negotiations over the two-state solution and the extent of that territorial integrity. Fourthly, a third of Israel's water resources are in the West Bank. There's circumstances where they often give them up because in those circumstances they wouldn't have access to that water, their state wouldn't function. Finally, it strengthens their negotiation position in future negotiations for a two-state solution. There's an incentive to continue to expand those territories and continue to weaken the position from which those Palestinians negotiate. They said that, well, we weren't including the right of return, but we were including lots of other things that the Palestinians wanted, like aid and a functioning economy. If it was true that those were the things that Palestinians want, we thought that was exactly the reason why they would be more likely to accept our proposal, because it would give them access to the Israeli state where the vast majority of employment was, or it would give them access to those jobs that do continue to keep them in poverty at the moment. If that was the thing that was going to make the Palestinians more likely to accept their solution, it was the exact same thing that would make them more likely to accept our solution, except theirs would be a basket case with aid, and ours would be access to a functioning economy where those people could be employed. We weren't likely, we were the team that undermined the rhetoric of Hamas by giving people a legitimate solution, rather than merely arguing for circumstances where we could get as much land as possible. When you put another solution on the table, you give the PLO an advantage in the negotiations and discussions in relation to Hamas, and in those circumstances, those people would be able to negotiate more effectively. Finally, they never told us why Israel would be willing to give up the blockade, why Israel would be willing to forfeit its water resources, and why those economic opportunities shouldn't extend to those people. And finally, to the extent that they believed in Palestinian statehood, they were totally willing to screw them in Gaza and give up their request there. We thought in many circumstances, if Palestinians were able to accept a different solution, we should put this solution on the table. But there's stronger materials about why Israel would never accept this proposal. They told us, on the one hand, they were scared of being overrun, but the most likely outcome of this proposal was that the Palestinians would be subsumed with an ethnic minority by more powerful Israelis. Maybe they want to work out that tension as like a perception to Israelis versus a reality of what would occur. But even if that is true, I think it's in many circumstances, it shows the possibility that Israelis could back the fact that they had the resources to continue to control that state to some extent, they wouldn't be so scared of being overrun. The fact that they continue to live with a 10% minority to some extent indicates that they're willing to do that. The Israelis are increasingly voting for parties that have Arab representation, shows that there are more liberal elements in that state and more willing to compromise a solution like this. Well, why would they be more willing to accept this solution than a two-state solution offered by the affirmative team? The first was that they were never willing to give up Jerusalem and the Jerusalem control to the UN. They thought that Israel had never accepted that in the past, and in those circumstances, that was going to continue to be a sticking point that meant that their solution wouldn't occur. The second thing was that our solution never required them to give up significant economic resources and significant border disputes that would potentially occur in those circumstances. So allowing Israel to continue to control, to some extent, the Gaza Strip would mean that we were less likely to have flashpoints of conflict in the Golan Heights, like Nina spoke to you about, but also didn't require them to put themselves in a fractured situation in relation to the future of their water resources. Let's then now turn to the question of whether the Palestinian state, under their proposal, would meet the requirements of statehood, as Beavis talks about in his speech. He told us a few things. The first was that because of the luxury of birth and the absence of where you're born, it's really important to have the ability to self-govern. What happens under the status quo while we continue to prioritise the negotiation of a two-state solution is that it's very difficult for Palestinians to govern anything effectively because the blockade continues. They have no access to any economic resources that could continue to get those people out of poverty. These guys won't just say they're going to abolish the blockade. They're going to have to explain to us why Israel's incentives change under their proposal to any significant degree. But to the extent that he told you that the Palestinian people have a unique cultural tradition that met the criteria of statehood, he didn't tell you that what economic resources they could accrue in circumstances where they could legitimately form a state. In those circumstances, we thought that was a criteria that substantive point in his speech didn't ever consider. But in those circumstances, we were willing to prioritise a different solution that said a two-state solution would never have a legitimate Palestinian state, or at least a Palestinian state with 6% of the West Bank, an ongoing blockade, and in those circumstances, inability to access key economic resources in Israel. Even if we accepted they could access Jerusalem, it meant that those citizens would never fully accept or fully have the rights of the state that Beavis said was so important to those people. So the final question in this debate then is if this state if we accept that there could be a two-state solution or a one-state solution, which side better deals with the politics that occurs in those situations? The first thing we told you was that conflict resolution is better under our system. That in circumstances where more states have to cross international borders and assassinate individuals who could potentially bring them to trial in their own jurisdiction, that would decrease the incentives for radicalisation of those conflicts and the escalation of those conflicts. That in circumstances where you continue to oblige them to cross international borders and kill people, that would continue to empower the radical elements of the Palestinian fight. That Hamas will continue to have power to fight back in those circumstances and fight back for increasing expansions of their territory. Because the borders they would get under the negative terms proposal would never be acceptable to Hamas, and that argument would continue. The second thing we told you was that the political effects would be to narrow the effects of radicalisation in that event. This team weren't sure whether the Israelis would be totally subsumed by an Arab majority or that they would assert their total power over them as a result of their economic resources. We think that ambiguity demonstrated the potential of this solution. That in many circumstances there were liberal elements of the Jewish population who could get on board with a number of things that Arab Israelis would want to see introduced in those states, and that was the subset of Nina's material. But Nina's material also indicated why it was particularly important to act now. That in circumstances where we wanted a resolution and both teams agreed that it was improbable, that in circumstances where Orthodox Jews were breeding at a rate 7 times of their reform equivalents within their own countries, it was far more likely that we'd get a solution now. We should put our priorities into a one-state solution rather than a two-state solution. Because that increasingly radical Israeli population would become increasingly militant, become increasingly attacking, and increasingly expand into the illegitimate and increasingly narrow Arab territory that existed under the status quo. It seemed improbable that Israel would give up the settlements, and in that context it seemed improbable that Palestinians ever have any legitimate territory under the proposal of the negative 10. For exactly those reasons, we should pursue a different solution to the one we've failed for the last few decades.
Mr. Chair, Don started his speech with a really interesting statement that really hurt their case. He said the PLO has never accepted and would never accept and has not done so since 1988 anything less than full sovereignty. In light of the fact that we told you that the Palestinians want sovereignty of their own land, they don't want to be absorbed into a Jewish state, in light of the fact that we told you that they deserve that self-determination, and if that fact is true, they will never agree to a one-state solution, your case has fallen down. I have 3 things to bring you in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to analyse which solution is more likely. Secondly, I'm going to explain to you why a two-state solution is far better for both Israelis and Palestinians in the world in which both were likely and we could choose. And finally, I'm going to look at some broader political implications. So firstly, which is more likely? On Israel's side, Don told us this. He said that West Bank has all these water resources, and for that consequence, Israel will never give any rights or lose any autonomy over that area. Mr. Speaker, I hate to argue by facts, but far more water flows out from Israel to the West Bank than the opposite, Mr. Speaker. Israel does not rely on the West Bank for water resources. That was an absurd assertion from Don at the beginning of his speech. But then we heard from Nina, and again from Don, that Likud and the Israeli right in general will never give up control of the West Bank for some reason. Mr. Speaker, Palestinians functionally have autonomy told you was incredibly important. But at the end of this point, it's incredibly important to realise that Israel does want peace. Like, it is not beneficial for either side of this debate to say that Israel will not accept anything. Obviously, that means that both side loses the debate. Like, the majority of people in Israel want peace. The reality is, though, because Ed told you that the Jewish state and the integrity of that Jewish state is so integral and important to not just the Israeli right, but every Jewish person and every Israeli person that lives there, overrunning that state or a perception of overrunning that state is something that is so damaging to that will necessarily radicalize Israel internally. That's the problem. Secondly, on this issue, we heard from that side that neither side, but in particular Israel, will ever accept a UN protectorate over Jerusalem. Okay, as the Jew in the room, I'm going to explain to you what Jerusalem is about. It's not about access to land, it's about access for religious rituals, it's access for a religious purpose. So when we give both sides access, in that religious sense, both sides the ability to go to Jerusalem, to pray at the Wailing Wall, to use it for that will, they are far more likely to agree to that solution. The reason that Israel doesn't agree to that, to any sort of giving up of Jerusalem or allowing a right of return, is they don't want those political rights for the Palestinians to overrun the political rights of Jews in that state, because they think that there is a far greater population, which is empirically true, a far greater population of Muslims. That is the problem, and that's why a UN protectorate is far more likely to be negotiated. On what the Palestinians are far more likely to want. Because of all the reasons we heard from Donald a moment ago, we think that the Palestinians actually want a state. Bemis told you why they deserve a state with respect to the Montevideo Convention, but putting that aside, all of their international policy interests fall in line with protecting themselves, protecting their border, having their own national identity, having their own self-determination and self-interest. The fact that Palestine will roll over and say, well, I mean, we wanted a state really, really bad, but I guess we could just be Israelis too and part of the Jewish state, is an absurd assertion in this debate and never stood right from the start. So that's why a one-state solution is an absurdity and will never achieve any meaningful outcome. The reason that we will accept, or either side will be more likely to accept a two-state solution is because both sides want peace, is because Israel will never accept a right of return, and for the reality that they won't accept overrunning their state with Muslims. That's the sad issue in this debate. Finally, on which state situation is more likely. They wanted to throw mud at our model with respect to Gaza. Obviously, it was a little bit of a surprise for them, but the reality was that it is an imperfect solution. Sure, each situation is an imperfect solution, but what we wanted to avoid on the negative side of the house was a non-contiguous state, because that was far worse for our side of the house. So what did we do to overcome that reality? We said if you are in Gaza now and you want to be part of the Palestinian state, we can move you to the West Bank and give you all the political rights that would allow that freedom. We said if you identify more with the Egyptian way of life, the Egyptian political or religious class, that would be fine. That was why we dealt with Gaza being a small a sovereign state access to international aid, access to food, access to other resources, rather than allowing Israel to abandon its Jewish identity and abandon an Israeli state. The question is, which is more realistic, guys? That's why we want the realism in this debate. Secondly and finally, in this point on the region, we heard that the region on their side is getting so angry at Israel for not giving the Palestinians access to anything. Mr. Speaker, the consequence of their side of the house is the entirety of the Arab world and the Middle East seeing that Israel, after so long, not even giving Palestine what it wants, not even giving Palestine self-determination. Don conceded that the PLO and the Muslims in Palestine want self-determination. We think it's better for them to get that. We granted them that, albeit in an imperfect solution. The motion falls. The antagonism of Israel and Palestine in negotiations is problematic for both sides in this debate, and every debater has ever been unfortunate enough to debate about them. We need to analyse the logic behind why negotiations have failed, not just continuously point to examples of where they have. And that's what the negative team did in this debate. So given that, this debate turns on two questions. One, which you believe is actually more likely to occur if we all suspend disbelief and believe we could ever get a solution. And two, given we all need to get a solution, which solution is more preferable? That's what I'm going to answer in this reply. So first, which one are we capable of getting? And the affirmative team, I'll give them credit, did a really good job in this debate of listing examples of where negotiations have failed and pointing to sticking points. What they didn't do was a good job of responding to our analysis and logic about why those things can be less harmful under the system we propose. First, with regards to a right of return. And let's be clear about this. The lack of agreement, historically, for Israel to grant a right of return hurts their case significantly more than it hurts our case, because their entire model is premised on creating a state with a right of return for every Arab to live and vote and participate in that state. But beyond that, we actually analysed why a right of return wasn't necessary and why we could get a solution without it. Because we told you, Palestine doesn't want a right of return just because it wants a right of return. It wants a right of return to guarantee two things. Firstly, access to Jerusalem. Secondly, access to economic stability. We told you the international community could guarantee economic stability, and in fact would be much more likely to do so when they had a sovereign state to deal with than under the status quo. But we secondly told you with regards to Jerusalem that Palestine would happily accept a Jerusalem that was administered by the United Nations, because they'd have an actual guarantee of access to that territory, which was much more reliable than the guarantee that Israel provided. So the question then was, would Israel accept the UN-administered territory of Jerusalem? We told you that Israel ultimately wants peace. We acknowledge that we like control of Jerusalem, but we think they are more likely to accept a UN-administered territory than to give up a part of Jerusalem in order to create this state. We also think, incidentally, they would be more likely to accept this UN-administered territory than allow every single Arab who lived in that region to vote in their democratic elections and overwhelm their state. And this was given to you all at Ed when he told us that the Jewish homeland is so important to those individuals and the identity and the sanctity of that homeland is critical. We told you that and they would always be more likely to accept our solution. But then with regards to borders, the affirmative team had a real crack in this debate at proving that Gaza and the fact that we gave it to Egypt would be a real significant stumbling block. I told you a couple of things on this. Firstly, Gaza was a tiny speck of useless land that in actual fact wasn't going to be that integral to the success of the Palestinian state, and that any individual in Gaza who really identified with the Palestinian state is capable of moving to the West Bank and actually engaging in that state that we established. With regards to the borders and with regards to the territory, we told you we'd be more likely to get Palestinian agreement when they actually given territory of their own than given part of a one state with no guarantees that Jews would ever be forced to move out of that settlement. Finally, with regards to water, we told you that the actual facts in this debate are that Israel exports water to Palestine. Even if that weren't true, the international community could guarantee that water to Israel. So in reality, our solution was more likely than Israel giving up on the homeland that Ed proved was so critical to it. But which was better? And the first thing we need to do here is remember that both of these individual states, both Jews and Palestinians, want a state of their own. And we think that's evidence enough to prove that they think it's going to be better for them. But with regards to Israel, we told you, the moderation internally that Nina pointed to was in actual fact never guaranteed by their model. In fact, Beavis told you might be less likely to happen, so they fell down on that. With regards to moderation, with regards to the Palestinians, we told you when those two were forced together to engage in a political system, you are less likely to get moderation and more likely to have those individuals radicalised as they were both fighting to gain control of the state they were now forced into live together. At the end of this debate, we proved that a two-state solution was better for both parties and more likely. We were very happy to oppose this motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are two questions that demand this room's attention at the end of this debate. Firstly, the most important question: which policy is more likely to be accepted and reach an agreement? Because the premise of this debate was an empirical reality that two-state solutions had always been rejected. And re-proposing those models, even if you had 6 prongs, in a way that presumed that the negative team knew better how to resolve those sticking points, was not surprising to it. It made less sense than Holly Jenkins. There were 5 points that we thought were sticking points that made two-state solutions impossible. Firstly, the West Bank. It had never been fully offered, Mr. Speaker. A maximum of 20% had been offered. We gave you 3 reasons why. Firstly, those settlements were incredibly strategically important to Israel. Secondly, they were incredibly economically important because of the massive cost of resettling 230,000 Jewish people, and because it did have a third of the water supply of Israel within it, collect, even though your manifold potential wasn't up to date. Also because the incentives to create that buffer existed, particularly in the context of creating boundaries. So when Palestine needed full sovereignty of that in order to administer its state effectively, but Israel was never willing to give up that state, we were never going to have a solution that resolved those things. We told you that our policy meant that settlements could stay where they were, because no longer would the PLO object, because now the economic resources that came out of that region could be redistributed by the new parliament that had Palestinian representation within it. The second sticking point was Jerusalem, and these guys just said that they could make it an international protectorate without analysing why Shas was unlikely to veto it, as they had at all times in the past. We had no analysis as to either why that was the case, or as to why Kosovo was a particularly good example of peaceful neutrality. We said that it was unlikely to exist, and that one nation would allow all citizens access to those spiritual resources. We were happy for that to be the case. The third thing that they were doing is giving Gaza to Egypt to avoid the idea of contiguity. We said that Israel would have a problem with giving land to the Muslim Brotherhood, but also Palestinians wouldn't be happy for their ethnic brothers and sisters that James Beard is so well articulated to just be given to another state altogether. Fourthly, we told you that the right of return was a sticking point, and it wouldn't just be solved by aid, because aid would not produce jobs or access to water or compensate the people that needed to be removed from that land. Finally, there were political problems that were the sticking point. These guys said that Israelis feared getting overrun because it would compromise their national identity and change the balance of power. We told you a couple of things. Firstly, that overstated the balance of popularity in those two countries, when peace was so important to those people, when they didn't want to have to live under the fear of constant Qassam rocket attacks. We thought that both Palestinians and Israelis would likely be able to compromise if that compromise was possible. But more to the point, that even if there was, even under Gemma's own analysis, Israel was likely to be able to balance out that fear with its own economic resources and establish political power in a way that meant that we had an imperfect democracy that was certainly better than the conflict that we currently have. That imperfect democracy was not only not better than ongoing skirmishes and ongoing poverty for the Palestinian people, it was also better than a solution that gave Palestinian people a border and a state that made them legitimately able to seek an arms agreement that Israel would never accept. So in the most important question of this debate, who is able to achieve an agreement, this team won. And that's important because it ended conflict and ended terrorism on that border. Which solution, though, was better for the citizens of those countries? We thought that the rhetoric of Hamas and the legitimacy that they claimed for their current rocket attacks and antagonism was because of the continued pursuit of a two-state solution. That when you brought those people together, gave them political enfranchisement and representatives within the parliament, you made it more likely that support would go to Fatah and that Hamas would have to moderate. Because now progress lied in the ability of your representatives to seek political change, and that was likely to only happen when you weren't antagonizing. These guys said that Israel wouldn't be able to protect its interests, and then they said that they would be able to protect its interests. We told you we weren't particularly concerned about that. What we were concerned about is the 10% of Palestinians that were currently being the minority of the population that were being oppressed within Israel, and the vast majority of Palestinians within Palestine that were being deprived access to basic human rights that should trump the religious rights of Israel to have their own state. Mr. Speaker, this was an appropriate policy for the international community to see, because it was the only one that was ever going to pass. We proposed.